Greetings, everybody, and especially to this very international Zoom session sponsored by the American Folklore Society. I know that we have people all over the globe here, and I welcome you all. Originally, this session was to be a conversation with Haya Bar-Itzhak, and she is not available. And we wish her well and mishberach. So what we've done is to introduce members who are here, who are contributors to a festschrift that was presented to Haya and which she received this summer. This session is sponsored by the AFS History and Folklore section, which I'm a convener, the AFS Jewish Folklore and Ethnology section, which I also convene, the AFS Oral History Project, and the Fellows of the American Folklore Society. The title is Masoret Haya on Haya Bar-Itzhak, the concept of living tradition and Jewish folkloristics. We want to talk about the festschrift, as well as a concept that she championed throughout her career of the idea of lived religion, Jewish living tradition, Israeli folkloristics, as well as folkloristics generally. Haya Bar-Itzhak is an international fellow of the American Folklore Society and professor emerita at the University of Haifa, where she was head of folklore studies and director of the internationally renowned Israel Folktale Archives. She also has had professorships at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn State University, Indiana University, University of California-Berkeley, and the University of Michigan. She's the author and editor of more than 10 books on Jewish and Israeli folklore, and a prominent voice internationally for comparative folklore studies of living traditions. Commentators will discuss the concept of living tradition, the significance of Jewish and Israeli folklore studies in international folkloristics. Bar-Itzhak's scholarly and organizational contributions to international folkloristics and future directions based upon these contributions will be discussed. And at the end, I hope to have time for your questions and comments, and I would ask you if you would place them in the chat just to organize this, because we have a number of people in the audience, and I will try and read them and present them to the group. I am going to go in the order of the program and start with remarks by Ben-Amos, and then I'm going to give it over to the lead editor of the festschrift, Tsafi Sebba-Elran, who will introduce the other two participants. Don, if you're there. All right. Maybe Don's having trouble logging on. So we'll do a quick pivot. And let me, if he is having trouble getting on, let me also indicate that Haya's daughter, Haya Bar-Itzhak, who's now at Stanford University, is also in this session, and she may have some remarks at the end on behalf of her mother, if that's all right, Chen. So I don't see Don has logged on yet, so let me switch to Tsafi, and who will have remarks and introduce the other editors and contributors.
Okay, all right, thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Good.
But you're not in the slideshow mode. Yeah, now you are.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Simon, for initiating and organizing this panel and for the opportunity to discuss Haya's contribution to the study of Jewish folklore in light of the festschrift that you can see in the presentation. For me, it is an opportunity to zoom out and reevaluate the outcome of our efforts And I will begin by using this stage to thank my colleagues and friends, Dr. Idit Pintel-Ginsberg and Dr. Haya Milo, for our pleasant work together on the volume. Masoret Haya, A Living Tradition, is a bilingual volume. It appeared as part of the Israel Folktale Archives series of publication, a series that was published, like our volume, in a collaboration with Pardes Publishing during the years when Haya was the academic head of the archives and is still ongoing today. As some of you already know, the book structure is slightly different from that of other festschrifts. Each of its 33 chapters opens with a primary source, usually a folktale, followed by a discussion that includes the author's interpretations. This is how Haya and Idit edited the IFA's Jubilee volume that you can see now on the presentation, The Power of a Tale, published in English last year by Penn State University Press as part of the Raphael Patai series in Jewish folklore and anthropology. The idea was to create a book that is both a collection of stories and a collection of studies, a book that allows readers to think about the texts not only through the author's eyes, but through their own. This editorial principle reflects the primacy and the collective importance of ethnographic work side by side with its study and interpretation, an idea that is fostered throughout Haya's work as well. Haya herself has conducted a considerable amount of fieldwork and devoted an entire book to the work of Jewish ethnographers in Eastern Europe called Pioneers of Jewish Ethnography and Folkloristics in Eastern Europe. One of the most important ethnographic projects in which Haya took part was the pioneering Bet She'an project, which yielded about 300 new folktales recorded between 1977 and 1979. It was edited with Professor Elisa Shenhar. One of the chapters of Haya's festschrift, written by Dr. Dani Shrira from the Hebrew University, deals with a photo from the project that also appear on the back of our volume. I hope you can see it here. In this chapter, Shrira points to the relaxed atmosphere around the table and notes how the collectors look at their hosts as equal, eye to eye, and look at the 3 empty teacups in the middle. Unlike the photo that appears at the beginning of Shrira's chapter, a photo from Ansky's expedition. The photos from Bet She'an open a window into the lives of local informants and present them from internal point of view. This is why, according to Shrira, this event was known primarily as a project rather than an expedition, a concept that reflects a binary perception of the relationship between researchers and informants. For Haya Bar-Itzhak, ethnographic work is the heart of folklore studies. This is the essence of living tradition. Driven by the power of a cultural mission, she has always encouraged her students to be involved in fieldwork, and some of the fruits of their work are included in the volume. I would also like to say a few words about the contributors' choice of texts or narratives. As I've said, contributors were asked to pick a folktale or any other representation of folk culture to present it and then to discuss it. We have tried to arrange the chapters chronologically from the ancient to the contemporary. The Hebrew part of the book opens with Professor Chaim Weiss reading in the Epistles of Bar Koziba, the leader of the Great Jewish Revolt against the Romans, and it ends with Professor Tamar Katriel's reading in the personal stories of Israeli soldiers that she calls fragments of stories. Note how from ancient times to the present, the Jewish people have been engaged in military training and in the folklore of soldiers. Between these 2 chapters, the volume includes a variety of stories from different times, but mainly modern Jewish and Israeli folktales that are available in the IFA or based on fieldwork. But it was the choice of genres that surprised me. 10 chapters, almost a third of the book, are based on pictures, internet memes, a Facebook page, and the like. Even the more traditional conception of folklore in the book as textual narrative is accompanied by images of an informant, of a recipe, of an object, and so on. All of these indicate, I think, the influence of social media on the creation and transmission of contemporary folklore, a topic that Professor Simon Bronner, the head of this panel, has written extensively about, and to which Haya Bar-Itzhak devoted an entry in her Encyclopedia of Jewish Folklore and Traditions. The centrality of visual narratives or narratives accompanied by images also reflect the influence of the visual turn on the study of folklore and the gradual and partial transition of traditional narratives from words to representations of place and of identity, a change we are witnessing these days as we collect the epidemic lore of COVID-19. I can't expand on the subject due to the time constraints, but this turn which changes the work of archivists, curators, as well as ethnographers of contemporary folklore requires new literacy skills and with them attention to new means of expression and new modes of transmitting and adapting of folk tradition. The first chapter of the English part of the book opens with a painting by Meir Kirschenblatt, which also appears on the cover of the book, The Cracker Wedding, a Purim Spiel as remembered by Meir Kirschenblatt. Attached to the picture is the story behind it, in the words of the painter himself, a story about a Jewish family and their house during the holiday of Purim. However, as the author, Professor Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimbelt, writes, these are two separate stories. The first story was painted by the painter, while the second was woven between the painter and his daughter. The voice of the text is the voice of our collaboration, she writes, following Mark Kaminsky. A third voice, which arises when 2 points of view are engaged in examining one life. In other words, a painting, a photograph, or an image constitute a narrative in itself, which can and should be discussed with reference to its unique means of expression. Similarly, all the pictures and images that appear in the book anchor the text as an art of time in a place, and thus give it a new context, or in Haya Bar-Itzhak words, taking from her book on Jewish Poland, they create the geography of memory. Dr. Amer Dahamshe calls the construction of place identities in his chapter a mental map, and Dr. Roslan Daim, Haya's students, calls it a ritual landscape. A broader discussion of the ways in which place identities are formed through the social imaginary appears in Dr. Chen Bar-Itzhak and Shachar Bar-Itzhak chapter about the construction of place identity, specifically Haifa, in a multi-voice internet narrative. All of this reflect a high degree of awareness of and attention to the relationship between memory, place, and story in general, and the connection between the verbal and the visual in particular. Moreover, I think all the discussion in this volume deal with the construction of sub- and transnational identities, mainly urban, gender, and ethnic identities that are often embodied in space and in return endow it with symbolic meanings. Another interesting aspect, and I think we can close the presentation now, unless you want to see the...
You can just stop share, stop share.
Yes, this is exactly what I try to do. Another interesting aspect of the choice of genres in the book is the extensive representation of humorous texts. A third of the book's chapters deals with humorous narratives, mostly anecdotes and jokes. Do people tell more jokes these days, or is it that we like to discuss them? In her chapter on the social and cultural difficulties of Ladino speakers in Israel, the late Dr. Nina Pinto-Abekassis shows how humorous texts represent the voice of the social and cultural margins and allow, as Bachtin says, to defer social norms and prohibitions, and perhaps even to enjoy an imaginary and temporary release from them. As various chapters demonstrate, women, immigrants, and different kinds of minorities use humor to undermine the hegemonic order and enjoy a momentary superiority. In his article about the Eshkol joke cycle, a cycle of jokes that circulated in Israel before the Six-Day War and was harshly critical of then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, Professor Dan Ben-Amos quotes an Israeli journalist who describes these jokes as dangerous and not funny in light of their subversive potential. The journalist writes, "Those are the jokes that put an end not only to the government, but to the state itself. And it will be very frightening if we won't see the red light that is flashing." According to Professor Elliot Oring, who also contributed a chapter to Haya's festschrift, Jewish humor isn't necessarily characterized by unique contents or forms, but rather by certain historical cultural circumstances, and it reflects the collective responses to them. Perhaps the popularity of humor reflected by this volume attests to the minority consciousness of Israeli and Jewish folklorists, or of the social circles they document. And it may also be an indication of their subversive national ethos, an ethos that creates, in Bachtin words, a twin world, a world in which the small and weak, at least in his own eyes, tower over the big and the strong. Whether this is a coincidence or not, it seems to me that Haya Bar-Itzhak represents this ethos in her research as well, which has been devoted to the revival of Yiddish and to restoring the voices of historical women figures, Jewish ethnographers, and forgotten cultural heroes. The primary sources that are the basis for our volume are written in this spirit in 7 different languages, and they are translated from an even wider variety. I would like to end by expressing to Professor Haya Bar-Itzhak my deep gratitude and appreciation for her unique contribution to the study of Jewish folklore, to wish her רפואה שלמה ושנים פוריות וטובות של מחקר ויצירה. Thank you. Simon, do you want me to continue?
Yeah, why don't you introduce Idit or Etty, depending on how you want to proceed.
Okay, so it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Idit Pintel-Ginsberg, a former coordinator of the Israel Folktale Archives, IFA, and a former student of Haya. And I think we can say that you are the author of at least 2 books on which you may elaborate. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Tsafi. Also, I see that Professor Dan Ben-Amos is here, so I don't know, Simon, if you want us to continue.
Why don't you continue, Edith, because I know you're going to give a summary of Haya's contributions, and then if it's all right with Dan, we'll let him make some closing remarks.
Okay. So first and foremost, I would like to send Haya, Professor Haya Bar-Itzhak, blessing for a complete recovery and good health, wishing her to gather strength and soon return to work on her fascinating research. And to all the participants, since we are still in the month of Tishrei, the 7 months that opens the Jewish year, I would like to wish us all a happy new year, Shana Tova. This particular year, we really need a lot of good wishes. A year that begins on the 7 months, yeah, the matter is quite puzzling. Indeed, complex is the lunisolar Hebrew calendar. About 40 years ago, at the Oranim Seminary near Haifa, which specialized in training educational workers of the kibbutz movement, Professor Haya Bar-Itzhak led a teacher workshop on the subject of the Hebrew calendar, which culminated in the writing and publication of a curriculum on the subject for the kibbutz movement schools. I, as a novice kibbutz teacher, participated in it. Thus began the acquaintance between us that later turned into a friendship. In this workshop, the first characteristic of Haya's academy approach already emerged. There are more notable traits being her deep connection to Jewish sources in the study of text, Her sense of mission and commitment to propagate Jewish folklore and folk literature. This commitment accompanies the various subjects she researched and is dedicated to. And lastly, the personal affinities that Haya has for this subject and the people connected to them. The same year, Haya engaged in the first ethnographic project in Israel in Beit Shean, a then small and remote town inhabited mostly by new immigrants. She, of course, recruited us, the workshop participant, to take part in the ethnographic fieldwork. The project aim was to collect all the folktales remembered by the people living in Beit Shean and their traditional storytellers from the former homelands. Soon after, she led a second ethnographic field trip in the development town of Shlomi on the Lebanese border. Since the Dr. Tsafi Sebba-Elran elaborated about this project and a lot has been written by Haya herself, I will not be expanding on the subject. To sum up the academic work of Professor Haya Bar-Itzhak, as I was requested to do for Haya's festschrift, is an interesting and fascinating challenge, because it is not enough to summarize her work through a linear and chronological review of the main topics she researched, the article and book she published. By the way, the impressive list appears at the beginning of the book. Such a review does not reflect the main essence of Haya academic achievements. A more accurate and reflective description would be of a web intertwining meticulous research, extensive knowledge on the subject, along with profound and original thinking. Woven in all of these is also the personal aspect. The subjects Haya chose for her research are close to her heart. Often, her choice is driven by a sense of mission and responsibility for the discipline. More than once, she told us, while talking about a particular subject that had not been adequately researched, I need to write about it. And even though we are dealing with the humanities, described by some with the derogatory term Luftgeschäft, Haya is also blessed with an excellent ability to implement ideas into deeds. The traits just described are evident in the topics she chose to research over the years. I would like to offer some examples here. The first one being her research on Poland and Polish Jewry. Poland was Haya family's homeland. Using her broad knowledge of languages, she translated texts from Yiddish, German, and Polish for extensive research on Polish Jewish life, portrayed in traditional legends. She addresses the most dreadful issue of the Holocaust through the Jewish-Polish legends of destruction, but pointed to the optimistic tone of rehabilitation and resurrection upon immigration to Israel and through Zionism. This research culminated in the book Legend of Origin of the Jews of Poland, published in Hebrew and later in English as well. In her research on folktale, as told by Polish Jews in Israel, she included her father's stories. These were published in her books, The Power of a Tale and Israeli Folk Narrative. She has a deep and emotional connection to Yiddish, a language not spoken in her family. The extensive knowledge of it she acquired on her own. Haya was one of the initiators of and acted for the publication of Chuliot, a journal of Yiddish culture issued during the years 1994 to 2008. Its subtitle was Pages for Research in Yiddish Literature and its affinity to Hebrew literature. Another topic of Haya's research, to which she has a profound bond, is the kibbutz. In Kibbutz En Harod in the Israel Valley, which was founded in 1921, and which she knew since her youth, she collected stories from the local narrator, establishing with him a solid and long-lasting friendship. She also recorded the stories of the kibbutz first children, back then they were around 80 years old, about their childhood memories of Hanukkah and Shavuot, two major holidays of the secular Zionist movement. Supporting one of her students who worked at Kibbutz Ginosar, she researched local legends about the founding of this kibbutz, at the center of which stands the jujube tree. The fruits of these studies were published in several articles and in the first chapter of her book, Israeli Folk Narratives. An additional topic in which a personal interest and commitment is intertwined with serious and precise research is women in folk literature. Over the years, Haya wrote 10 articles on this topic, a major one being Sebba-Elran, the Moroccan Cinderella, published in English in 1993. It is a brilliant article, imperative to all folk literature students. Along with comprehensive and clear explanations of the theoretical foundation of ethnopoetic, the article is woven with the love, respect, and appreciation she has for the elderly and weary woman narrator. Out of personal interest, together with a general desire to advance women's standing at the University of Haifa, Haya serves as consultant to the president of the University of Haifa and rector on women's affairs. As part of this function, she promoted the rights of pregnant female students, as well as assuring the availability of facilities for the benefits of young mothers attending the campus with her babies. Another aspect of promoting women's standing in the academic world is the support she provided to her doctorate students, most of whom were women already well above the average student age, some of them being mothers. She patiently guided them, helping to obtain scholarship and financial support, leading them to PhD degrees accomplishment. There are currently 8 PhD researchers who were Haya students, all women. Her commitment and sense of responsibility to our discipline is reflected in a number of areas. Drawing folklore nearer to children by building curricula for the school system and editing a book of folk tales about holidays. Taking upon herself for 20 years the administration of IFA, the Israel Folktale Archives, named in honor of Dov Noi, and leading it into the 21st century by supporting the digitization of its collection. Her willingness to provide knowledge to folklorists in the West, as presented in her book, Pioneers of Jewish Ethnography and Folkloristics in Eastern Europe, and I quote from the book, some of the most important contributions of the pioneers of Jewish folklore studies in Eastern Europe, end of quote. She provided the key writing of 6 early folklorists, translating their works from Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, and German. All languages she's fluent in. The greatest enterprise that Haya undertook was, of course, editing the Encyclopedia of Jewish Folklore, an idea initially conceived by Professor Raphael Patai, which materialized only after Haya took the lead. It is considered today to be the first comprehensive and professional encyclopedia dedicated to this field of knowledge on an unparalleled scale in the study of Jewish folklore. Haya loves literature, an innocent and conscious love. In 2013, at the University Board of Trustee meeting, Haya led a special session about the beginnings of the University of Haifa. Prior to the meeting, Haya turned to the founders of the university, who were not by chance close friends, and asked them to share with the audience the stories of the beginning of the establishment of the university and their own start there. She too shared her story of how she began studying literature at the University of Haifa. She told us that after not being able to fulfill a desire to study physics at the Technion, she did not give up and decided, and here I quote, "I will go and try to study what I love most, only I did not think it should be studied, literature," end of quote. After being accepted into the literature department, Haya ends her story with the words, "I have been here ever since." Indeed, in her rich academic career, she is present, all of her, as a researcher, as a woman, and as a person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Idit. And now Etty BenZaken, also a former student of Haya, an artist, a vocalist, an independent researcher, and I think the author of 4 or maybe 5 original books. Etty.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. And it's really great to be here. And I first would like to thank Haya Bar-Itzhak, because I feel really so grateful to have been her student, and studying with her made a big impact on everything I do, both as an artist and as a scholar. So thank you, Haya. Refuah shlema mikol halev. In my paper that is included in Masoret Haya, in this amazing, colorful new book in honor of Haya, the paper that is called Hakol Hanocheach Bakol, the voice that is present everywhere, I discuss 3 Jewish Spanish folk texts that refer to the very sound of the female voice. One of them is the Judeo-Spanish romanza ¿Por qué no cantas la bella? Why don't you sing, beautiful maiden? Which I will sing for you now. I chose this text for my paper because it depicts how daily, how natural for Judeo-Spanish women was the act of singing. So as I said today, I will simply perform the romanza, of course part of it because it's very long, but first let me read to you the translation, because as you know, romanzas are like stories being sung. So here's a very simple translation I made into English. The king has one daughter, a gifted only daughter. Her father, for her honor, built her a castle. Sitting at the window, she was embroidering a nightgown for the queen's son, embroidering with gold, working with silk, and between one stitch to another, she was weaving pearls. But why don't you sing, my dear? Why don't you sing, beautiful maiden? Why don't you sing, my dear? Why don't you sing, beautiful maiden? Why don't I sing? I do not sing, nor shall I sing, because my love is in the war. I will write a letter. I will sign my demand. Bring my love back to me, alive, healthy, free. And if you don't bring him to me, I will wage a great war with ships on the sea and armed men on land. If there will be no captain, I myself shall hold the flag for all the people to say, long live that maiden, that in order to save her beloved, threw herself into the storm. So of course it's beautiful to see, as many scholars already pointed out, how the romances show women as active, as brave figures. In this case, she's waging a war, she rescues her beloved. But what interested me was the question in the beginning of the romanza, why don't you sing? It seems that the sight of a maiden singing while embroidering was so common, so daily, that to see one that is embroidering in silence was an exception. So who are those who ask her? Who are those who notice this change in their soundscape? And was her singing usually heard only inside the castle, the home, or also outside of the window at which she was sitting? So food for thought, and I will sing to you ¿Por qué no cantas la bella? Dedicated to Haya, of course. Una hija tiene el rey, una hija regalada, su padre por más valor, un castillo la fraguara, bordando está un camisón para el hijo de la reina, bordando está con oro, labrando está con seda, y entre puntada y puntada, una chofar y una perla. ¿Por qué no cantas mi bien? ¿Por qué no cantas la bella? ¿Por qué no cantas mi bien? ¿Por qué no cantas la bella? No canto ni cantaré, que mi amor está en la guerra. Y en una carta escribiré de mi puño y de mi letra, que me tragara mi amor, sano y vivo y sin cadenas. Y si no me lo trajeren, yo armaré una grande guerra de labios por la mar, de gente armada por tierra. Si no hubiere capitán, yo me tendré la bandera para que diga la gente, la vida esa doncella que por salvar a su amor a ella la tormenta.
יופי. דן, אתה מוכן? Okay. So let me introduce Don Ben-Amos. Dan, you'll need to be unmuted.
I didn't realize that I'm mute. I'm talking from Philadelphia, and in preparing this session, I picked up in my library the dissertation of Haya Bar-Itzhak. And I don't know whether all of you know that, but she wrote about saints' legends. And in some way, let's say, we are connected there, because she wrote about, she collected stories about the Besht, and I, together with the late friend of mine, Jerome Mintz, translated Shivchei Habesh. And so I found this personal connection with Haya, and rereading her dissertation, I feel very upset that it is not published, because this is a dissertation that it was written in 1987, and correct me if I am wrong, but it seems to me, to the best of my recollection, she was the last PhD students of our teacher, Dov Noy. And with this dissertation, I think she started a unique career among, and excuse me for saying that, I know I'm in Philadelphia, but among us Israeli folklorists. I feel, you know, as still in Petach Tikva. I think among the Israeli folklorists, more students of Dov Noy and his students, she maintains a connection both with the kibbutz and the shtetl, and both in terms of language and in terms of research and in terms of the internal connections that motivate all of us in studying Jewish folklore. Some of us went to the study of Haggadah and Midrash. Eli, you went and studied the Middle Ages, and but let's say she went and connected both the Yiddish, Polish, and the Sabra, the stories that are told in the kibbutz, and stories that are told by Moroccan Jews that came to Israel. So in some way, she embodies, I think, not only Israeli folklore or Jewish folklore, but the nature of what the country is now. What is also interesting in that, and I'd like to share it with you, that our connection, my and my wife Batsheva's connection with Haya is not just scholarly. It is personal, and we are friends on many levels. At our home, we still have a plant that she left in Philadelphia while she taught here and then returned to Israel. She celebrated the bar mitzvah of our first son, Ariel, in her home at Haifa. So our connections are personal, scholarly, and what else can I say? We love her, and we want her to be with us in the panel. I know that it cannot be done today, but I'm looking for the next panel where she is going to be the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. At this point, I want to give Haya Bar-Itzhak a chance to respond on behalf of her mother.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for the very heartwarming panel. My mother didn't give me any written response, but I would just like to extend her thanks to all the participants and to Simon for organizing this, and to Idit and Tsafi and Etty and everyone, and Dan. This is very heartwarming, and I know that she'll be very touched to listen to this later, so thank you.
Yes, this recording will be available until December 31st, and so she should be able to see it. I have a question to start off, but before I do that, I do want to invite everyone to pose questions for any of the participants or questions that you have about generally the concept of living tradition and Jewish folkloristics in the chat, if you would. The question I have for you is her comments, if she shared any, about receiving the festschrift and her response to the 33 essays that were there. And for everyone who's not aware, 33 is a magical number in Jewish folklore, as many of you know, the 33 days of the Omer, and a lot of others, the Remu, which I wrote about at Chaya's behest as well, where 33 was also very special. So anyway, did she have any comments or responses that you're aware of in regard to this festschrift? I think you need to be unmuted, Chen.
Sorry, I thought this was a question for Tsafi.
Oh, well, Tsafi may comment too. I think Tsafi hand-delivered it, did you not?
Not exactly. I left it for her, and I know she was very moved, and we didn't expand about it, but I don't know more than that.
I want to say something. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Haya for collecting us all together from 4 corners of the world. We haven't seen each other for so long. We didn't hear each other. And you see, Haya gave us this wonderful opportunity to meet each other. I think for me, I feel very moved. And secondly, for the first time, I didn't meet Haya personally. It was in the early 1970s, and I drove my car, and I heard on the radio someone speaking on folklore. I think it was Galei Tzahal, some those programs for soldiers. And I thought then, the early 70s, that I'm the smartest folklorist in Israel. And I stopped the car on the side and I said, look, this is a clear and intelligent voice that I don't know. And there's no question, that here we have a great folklorist in building. And then I was glad to call her, and I went to Haifa to meet her. And I think that this clear and intelligent voice is something that we can see all along her studies, work, her books, her articles, her speeches. And another thing I would like to say is that those festschrifts, actually, I always ask myself in what way a festschrift is reflecting really the person for whom it was dedicated. There is Galit here, and there is Dan here, and all the people for whom festschrifts were collected. And I think that both Tsafi and Idit presented in an outstanding way the way that this festschrift is reflecting the interests of Haya. First of all, the richness of periods. Secondly, the genre. And thirdly, I think that sensitive a turning point in Jewish history from the Shoah to the Tkuma, from the Holocaust to the revival of Jewish life after the Holocaust. I think that this is an outstanding festschrift that reflects her interest and her work. And the last thing that I would like to say, that any festschrift like this I think this is true about Galit and Dan and other people, is actually a push forward to continue our studies, to continue what we did until now. And I hope, and I'm sure that that's what will happen with Haya as well, that she will continue from here to give us her wonderful fruits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Seeing you also reminds me of a time we were all together, you, me, Don, and others, and that is in a conference that she organized or co-organized in 1999 at the University of Haifa. The theme was on Jewish community, which certainly got me thinking. The dialogue was indeed very useful. She also reminded me, like Don always has a piece of Petach Tikva in him, she reminded me that I need to go back to Kiryat Motzkin and revisit my roots there. But that was, while it was in jest, was also a way to talk about migration and roots and how important that is, not only to our understanding of Jewish identity, but also to Jewish folklore, this idea of mobility. And Don talked about her being between the shtetl and Israel and her many visits to the United States and her visiting professorships. And I still remember sitting on the porch and her observation on American Jewry, German Jewry, Israeli Jewry. And she really had this transnational perspective, keeping in mind the local as an inspiration, as well as the big global picture that I think can be an inspiration to a theme going forward. Are there questions or other comments that people want to make? I don't see any others in the chat, but again, feel free either to unmute or to pose a question in the chat. Were there others I left off that were at, Galit was also at that 1999 meeting, and there was not a separate publication out of that. It's too bad there wasn't. I did publish my presentation separately out of that, but that might be something, in fact, to recreate at some point. Donnie Schreer, I know you're the historiographer of Israeli Folkloristics. Do you have any comments on Haya or Dov Noy, who she also mentioned?
Well, I should say that this is a very awkward situation since Haya was one of the readers of my dissertation, so I feel a bit embarrassed about switching positions here. So first of all, I mean, I will use that to wish everybody Shana Tova, and also to wish Haya quick recovery and Refuah Shlema. But I mean, for me, Haya's work has been instrumental in different ways, particularly for Eastern European folkloristics, which is a vast topic. I remember when the book came out in the Slovenian press in Ljubljana, the Eastern Europe. I was writing my dissertation, and I was quite hysterical that I don't have it with me because it was very difficult for me to get it. And I was in the final writing phase, and I didn't want, to write something and then discover that something completely different appears in the book, and then it would be very awkward. But anyway, so for me, this book has been particularly helpful. It's a kind of a guideline in a way. It maps a very large terrain, and it helps make sense of very, very different people and with very different motivations and different practices. So it's a kind of, it's a map. It's a wonderful map. I think that for me, listening to this session, I never realized the Shtetl Kibbutz trajectory, and for me that was actually enlightening, because I mean, it's not just that, because I mean, Bet She'an was mentioned and Shlomi was mentioned, and I think that it's that, and it's also the Ayarot Pituach, it's the development towns, if you wish to call them. So I think that if we're thinking from the kind of dwellings, the different dwellings that Haya has been engaged with over the years, it's quite fascinating. I don't think so. The folklorists who looked at such diverse dwellings in different kind of circumstances. In that sense, it's and there's something very, yeah. I think that Chuliot. I don't remember who mentioned Chuliot here. Yeah, I think it's that's the word. Yeah, it is. That's the thing. It's how would you translate Chuliot now? Like you have in the spine. What's the word for Chuliot? Like a chain. Like a chain, yeah. No? Like
the link.
Continuity.
A link. Danny, a link.
A link, yeah, well, but links, today we think about hyperlinks and we think about internet. I don't know, there's something very tangible about Chuliot. Anyway, nevertheless, I think that it's very much connected to the idea of Masoret Haya, and I do also want to if I'm already speaking, then I love festschrifts. I don't know, festschrifts have some kind of strange reputation among people. I never realized, I never understood why. I think that festschrifts are great, and I love this festschrift. I think it's what Eli said is precise, and says it really reflects very well. So for the editors here, I mean, kol hakavod. So yeah, I'm gonna go muted again. Sorry.
Well, you're talking about festschrifts also reminds me of a contribution she made to the festschrift for Ben-Amos, which shows very well, I think, the linkage between what you're talking about in the Holocaust, Europe, and Israel, because basically she was talking about Holocaust hero legends as they are interpreted in Israel. And Don, I know, has read that piece as well as others, and I found that to be a very smart, connected kind of work. It also reminds me of Haya as an organizer. Haya did tell me several times of what to do with my life. I should tell you all, she was not shy about giving direction, even if I didn't ask for the advice. And part of that, I think, is her vision for the future of a transnational folkloristics. So in addition to the community study that I mentioned, she also was an organizer of the Going to the People conference at Indiana University, which did result in a publication, and she was a lot of the driving force behind that, and this vision of looking at the Ansky expedition again and thinking of that critically and what we can learn about that for today. So I definitely see that. So Chen, you're not alone in being a child of Haya's in the way that she told all of us how we should be doing better and better behaved, or maybe that was just me.
Can I say a word, please?
Sure.
Since Danny mentioned Chuliot, it reminds us of Dov Noy, my teacher, the teacher of many here, who always used to say that there is a golden chain between folklorists, and he created this family of folklorists, and Eli expressed the being moved by being together and so on. So Haya read Danny's dissertation. I read Haya's dissertation. And of course, Dov was my teacher. So we have a really a line of links of folklorists. I want to say that I really enjoyed teaching Haya's, I don't teach anymore, I'm retired from teaching. I enjoyed teaching her essay on the Moroccan Cinderella, which I taught very many times, and I agree that it's a very important and brilliant essay, and it's probably my favorite among her works. I appreciate her work on the history of East European Jewish folklorists and her work, of course, of Poland, the historical legends of Poland. But that essay, in its clarity and its complexity, is really my favorite. Most of all, I want to wish Haya a happy new year, a healthy new year, strength and health. And of course, I wish a happy new year to everybody here too. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Also, regarding the dissertation, it is true that she did not publish it as a book per se, but one of her first articles in American Folklore Journal was in the Journal of the Folklore Institute. This is before it was AFR, which was on saints' legends in Judaism. So some of you may want to look at that to see some of the excerpt. Tsafi, I do have a comment from one of our viewers here who asked you to elaborate or pick up on Haya's power of observation and this idea of the photo of people at the table. Are there other...
I think that about the photo, Danny should elaborate.
About the photo, well, Haya's family originally comes from Kremenitz, one part of the family. And I know that because once when I analyzed this famous photo of Kiselov from the Ansky expedition, she mentioned that, I think that maybe after the session. So it was clear to me that I'm going to analyze this picture for the festschrift. But then I thought, I became greedy and I wanted to see if there's a picture of the second expedition, as Dovnoy put it, in his introduction to the Bet Shean project. He was basically connecting to the Ansky expedition, the Bet Shean expedition. And then I asked the coordinator of the IFA for many years, I'm after a beer. Help me, people. Edna. And Edna dug into that. It took a while until she found the photo, the smoking gun, a photo of Haya Bar-Itzhak from the Bet Shean expedition. And then, so that allowed me to compare the two photographs. For me, I mean, whenever we speak in Jewish folkloristics about an expedition as this kind of tool or this kind of technology, let's say, then everybody returns to Ansky. And I think that there was a very interesting way to look at what happened in the Bet Shean situation. I think the major difference for me is the fact that when they visited Bet Shean, all of the people they encountered, like the people that we see here sitting around the table, they were all immigrants. Now, part of the power of expeditions is, for me, is the fact that you are mobile and the people that you meet are sedentary. They are there for forever. That's the kind of, that's the image that you have. And I think that part of the relaxation is the fact that it's much more egalitarian than most expeditions are. And also we are in the late 70s, the whole idea of how to do ethnography is different. The fact that even in the technological aspect, the fact that Haya has a tape cassette on her knees, something which would have been absolutely impossible to do in 1913, as you can imagine, which has these kind of strong power structures because the gramophone is such a huge machine. So there's something very comfortable. I'm looking at this photo even now, and each person has a different expression, and nobody's actually looking at the ethnographer in a way. That's quite remarkable. So, and actually one of the people in the photograph we are lately, Amos Noy, Dov Noy's son, is trying to contact the person sitting next to Haya. Well, it's a long story for a different session, but the person next to Haya is from Bet Shean, the man. And he was one of the local interlocutors. And I think that you had, I mean, it wasn't just the people from the university who came over. It was the kind of cooperation was much more, had a lot of ground. I mean, the people from within the city apparently cooperated. And Amos told me that there are a lot of people who remember this event. It was a major event in Bet Shean. To that day, people remember that event. So that's also very interesting to kind of reflect upon it. Almost, what are we, 40 years later? So I don't know if I answered the question.
Okay. I would like to add that a few years ago, the people of Bet Shean, the young generation who remembered it as students in high schools, because they were also involved, the school system of Bet Shean. So they came to Haifa, to Asai, and the person you ask, who is the person sitting near Haya, is now one of the leaders of the municipality of Bet Shean.
No, yeah, I know who he is. I mean, yeah.
And what seems to have happened, and what he said, that collecting the folktales and publishing them reinforce their self-esteem that they were able to go on and be the leaders, basically. It was building their leadership. So it had a very, very profound impact on all the new generation as well as the old ones.
But by the way, in the book, there are no photographs of folklorists. That's a major difference from the Ansky expedition. In the Ansky expedition, 90% of the photographs are of themselves. I mean, it's we are the folklorists kind of thing. And I mean, well, I'm exaggerating. Of course, there are other photos, but with the Bet Shean book, there are no photo. This photo is not in the book.
That is interesting. But I would also mention, again, this is based on her professorship at Penn State, for which I was a host at the time, and we did enter into conversations about her mentors and folklorists. And I do know that part of what she felt was her contribution was also to provide a woman's perspective. She was very sensitive to the process of fieldwork, and especially with women and the Moroccan women in her book on Moroccan women's narratives, and the way that their intellectual property was treated. And she definitely wanted to take a women's viewpoint in not only the interpretation, but also in the approach. I did not accompany her in Israel to that project, but I know that upon reflection, that was something that was very important to her, and something that also came out at the Going to the People conference, where she also spoke about Ansky and her reflections on that, and the project that was published with the Slovenian group on the Yiddish folklorists, who she also felt were more sensitive to the women tellers than some of the other traditions, and even the Jewish Culture Conference in Poland, where again she was making that connection on the legends of Poland. Perhaps some of you have also heard these conversations and can recount her actual field work then that was done with the Moroccan women that ended up as a publication for Wayne State University Press. If there I might add one other thing because Haya knows about this. In addition to the festschrift that I dedicated my book for Wayne State to Haya, and that's in the Raphael Patai series, edited by Ben-Amos. I wanted it to be a surprise, but then the press sent it to her in advance copy, so she knows that, and I hope that there will be other honors that are coming her way. I think she's had a profound influence on the field, not only in Israel, but also in the United States, partly because of all these professorships that she's held, and students still tell me how memorable those experiences in her class was. And while she was a proponent of living tradition, a class that she taught at Penn State was on the Bible and folklore. So she certainly was very aware of antiquity as well as the present, and like Juliot, was trying to make connections across time as well as in space. If there are no other comments or questions, I will. Did I hear something? Go ahead.
Yes, Janice. How can we, two quick things. How do we get a copy of the festschrift?
Tsafi?
I'll write you, Janice. I think I have your email, and I can give you more details.
Okay. Also, this is a sign. All of a sudden, Haya's Jewish Moroccan folk narratives from Israel popped up on my screen. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and Tsafi, if you want to also send me that information, which I can, in addition, share with the Jewish Folklore and Ethnology section members.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks. By the way, the idea of the title, Masoret Haya, was Ravit Raufman's, who is also here, Haya's student.
It's a very nice pun. Ravit, do you want to say some words about that?
Yeah, thank you. First, I would like to use this opportunity to also express my gratitude to Haya, who was my PhD supervisor, and she also had opened the door for my academic career, and I owe her my thanks and gratitude. I think while you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that many of her PhD students came from kibbutz. Idit and myself and Roni Kochavi, who I think is not here. And I'm not sure about one more. I don't want to make a mistake, but it's interesting to know that even though we came from different backgrounds, some affinity were created, maybe just happenstance, or as we know in folklore, nothing is merely a happenstance. So I just thought about it now. I also have one anecdote. I met Haya first when I was an undergraduate student. She just came from Berkeley, and she was teaching a seminar about women in folklore. And I wrote a dissertation about a maiden who poses riddles. And I thought that much of our relationship remained a kind of riddle, but on the creative manner, that we still explore the meaning of many things in an ongoing process. I came from a very different discipline, from psychoanalysis, and started my research on fairy tales, and I share a Galit feeling that Haya's Moroccan Cinderella is one of her best. And I think, like in psychoanalysis, so many has remained to be illuminated. I want to end with one anecdote. When I needed budget for things and I hesitated whether to ask for it or not, Haya used to tell me, Ravit, let other people refuse you. Don't say no to yourself. Other people can do it very well. So I adopt this phrase, and I used to tell it to my sons. Masoret Haya, you know, in Hebrew, it's a double meaning. because Haya is living, and I'm so happy that we can make this panel for her. Wish her very refuah shlema. Thank you for the organizers and Tsafi and Idit and you, Simon and Dan, and everyone who is involved.
My pleasure, and I also think of Chai, so it's nice that it gets in there because of all the religious as well as magico-religious meanings of Chai. But maybe that's my psychological thinking, and I have to say we had conversations about that. I'd be curious offline to hear about that. She wasn't always so crazy about some of my psychoanalytic ideas, but I do remember one paper she gave, and maybe Idit or Tsafi or you can tell me whether this got published. She gave a presentation at Penn State on the olive tree in kibbutzim and its symbolism that was
olive trees, no. Jujube trees.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it was not published, I think. It was published?
The olive trees, I don't know.
All right, but she did present that elsewhere and worked on that project. Yeah, she had a lot of interest, and her curiosity shows through, and I think that's an inspiration to the students who I knew took her. She would explore different ideas. She would go down those paths wherever they might lead, and that I think is an inspiration indeed for the future. Chen, do you want to say anything in closing?
No, just thank you all. It was a wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Please give her our love. And again, we expect to reunite soon, and so we can continue the very valuable conversation that she indeed initiated. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you'll keep in mind, speaking of conversation, next year in Harrisburg, and I will have a role in that as well as co-chair of that meeting. And I hope you all will come up with ideas, panels, session ideas that we can continue this very valuable conversation on Jewish folkloristics, living traditions, as well as comparative culture. Thank you all, one and all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. תודה לכולם.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.